doing more thinking about Franklin. And my real challenge, I think, is to tell you things about Franklin you might not know. And I'm just talking to a few members of the audience. I realize that's a high bar, since had I known how much people in this audience would care about Franklin, know about Franklin, I probably would have thought, why don't I talk about someone you don't know quite so well? And Benjamin Franklin really is, to my mind, one of the most extraordinary Americans. And I'll tell you a few things about him. One of the most striking facts I think about him was he was a close friend of George Whitefield, perhaps the greatest evangelist of the 18th century. Whitefield, in fact, stayed at his home in Philadelphia. He was also a close friend of David Hume, perhaps the greatest skeptic and free-thinking philosopher of the 18th century. And Franklin stayed at the home of Hume in Edinburgh. And he was also acquainted, actually more than acquainted, with Cotton Mather, the great Boston preacher, and with Voltaire, the great French philosopher and atheist. So you have someone who has these connections, these friendships, which transcend ideological boundaries. You think there is more to this than simply perhaps the stories we heard as children, although we'll get to those in a bit. Did you know that Benjamin Franklin is in the Swimming Hall of Fame? He was a great swimmer. He learned to swim, actually, first by reading a book about swimming, since swimming wasn't a popular pastime. And then in Boston's Mill Pond, this polluted waterway just off of the north end of Boston. But then he also swam, of course, in the Delaware and in the Thames and in the Seine. At the age of, in his 70s, he would swim across the Seine in Paris. And in fact, the reason he once swam as a way of showing off a 3-mile swim in London in the Thames. A group had gone on an excursion to a pleasure resort just east of the city. And on the boat back, he thought he would entertain the rest of the group by swimming about 3 miles in the Thames, showing off different strokes and moves and so on. And in fact, this is on his first visit to London. He had thought about, instead of going back to Philadelphia and going into trade or continuing to work in a printing shop in London, which is what he was doing, he would be a barnstorming swimming instructor in Europe, traveling around Europe, teaching the sons of the aristocracy how to swim. A Philadelphia acquaintance suggested that actually going back to Philadelphia and going to work in a shop would be a more productive use of his time. So he did that. However, not before he invented swimming fins that can be used on your hands, which still can be used. He was trying to do a similar thing with feet, but his misfortune was not having flexible material to make swimming fins for your feet. He's also a member of the Chess Hall of Fame. He was a great chess player. He also wrote, sometime in the 1730s, a little essay called The Morals of Chess, which is a printer he printed and circulated. Chess, he said, teaches us foresight, that is, being able to look ahead and to anticipate what you can do and what your opponent can do. It also teaches us circumspection, not betraying what you intend to do, and caution. It also teaches you not to be discouraged by bad appearances, by what at the moment seems like an insurmountable or insolvable problem, because this can change quite quickly. And also teaches you not to be presumptuous. You have everything lined up, and then your opponent can do something to upset all of your assumptions. And he also has rules. For example, if you are playing, you shouldn't sing or whistle while your opponent is thinking about his moves. This little essay on chess was printed in the 1780s in the first book in Russia printed about chess. Now, I'm not suggesting that Franklin taught Russia how to play chess. They already were doing quite well at it. But here is his essay on chess being printed in St. Petersburg in the 1780s. In France in the 1780s, Franklin did play chess quite a bit. In fact, in 1774 in London, he was in London as the relationship between the British Empire and the American colonies was disintegrating. He remained in London hoping to prevent the crisis that seemed to be appearing. And he was at the Royal Academy in London, and a gentleman said to him, "There's a lady who would like to play chess with you." And he thought it would be presumptuous of him to go call on this lady to play chess. And a week or two later, the man said, "This lady really would like to play chess with you." And so he does call upon the lady who wanted to play chess. The lady turned out to be Catherine Howe, whose brothers were William Howe, the general, and Sir Richard Howe, the admiral. That is, the two military officials being sent to America to suppress the rebellion. And the reason Catherine Howe wanted to play chess with Benjamin Franklin was so that her brother, the admiral, could come and talk to Franklin about possibilities of preventing the breakup of what Franklin called that fragile China vase, the British Empire. In Paris in the 1780s, he would play chess. And there is one story about him actually capturing his opponent's king. And his opponent, a French lady, said, "We don't take the king." Franklin said, "In America, we do." Now, of course, we're not here because he's a member of the Swimming or Chess Halls of Fame. I should, however, point out he's also in something called the Hall of Fame of Great Americans. And this is actually the first Hall of Fame established in the United States, set up in the 1890s in New York. Has anyone been to the Hall of Fame of Great Americans? And he was nominated to be in the inaugural class, and a fellow setting up the Hall of Fame did send his list of nominees to various eminent people to vet. And the junior senator from Massachusetts, George Frisbee Hoare, who was also the president of the American Antiquarian Society, sent a blistering letter as to why Benjamin Franklin should not be in the Hall of Fame of Great Americans. And Senator Hoare was quite scandalized by something that had been read at a gentleman's dinner he attended, which demonstrated to him that Franklin was a person of such marked vulgarity that it would bring down the level of the other members of the Hall of Fame of Great Americans, including George Washington, who was elected unanimously to have Benjamin Franklin sully this institution with his presence. Edward Kelly, the fellow setting up the Hall of Fame, I am sure then went to track down what it was that Franklin had written to get him blackballed by Senator Hoare for membership in the Hall of Fame. And its rationale, an acquaintance apparently wrote to Franklin asking for his advice on if he wanted to enjoy the company of the other sex but not get married, what would be the best way to do it? And Franklin's suggestion was that he should choose an older woman as a mistress. And he said this may seem like a paradox, but Franklin explained why older women made better mistresses. They're more discreet, for one thing. And then for another, of course, they're more interesting than young women. They've had more experience. They know more about the world. And he also had some things to say about age and the aging process. And he also said that it's less of a sin it's a great sin to debauch a virgin and perhaps ruin her life, when on the other hand, you could make an older woman happy. And the final reason he said was, they are so grateful. This, for Senator Hoare, would be enough to keep Franklin out of the Hall of Fame of Great Americans. And it does get us perhaps to the first reason why Franklin still stands out, aside from still being able to make people laugh. He was a printer, and that is, he circulated news, he circulated information. He also circulated what we would have, I guess now would have to call fake news. For example, he published in the 1740s a little essay about Polly Baker. It's actually the speech of Miss Polly Baker. Miss Polly Baker was charged by a court in Connecticut for the 5th time with having a child out of wedlock. And the little heading for this story said, this is the speech of Miss Polly Baker on her 4th time of being brought to court for having produced a child out of wedlock. And the speech that caused the judges to absolve her of all guilt, and one of the judges married her the next day. And Miss Polly Baker explains that she's been brought here for simply obeying the first commandment, which is to be fruitful and multiply. She's added more to the king's population here. She's brought up her children, actually provided for them, not asking the town for help. She said it would have been easier had she not been fined so often by the town for producing children out of wedlock. And she also says she's never refused an offer of marriage. In fact, the only one she was ever given, she accepted. But then the person who made the offer rescinded it, and she looks to the bench saying, I was hoping to see him here today. And she concludes by saying, not only should she not be fined, she thinks that perhaps a statue should be built to her. It's an amusing little story. And in the 1770s, when Franklin is in Paris, the Abbé Raynal, a French philosopher, who had written a book about the Indies, about America, and he had quoted this story. This is an example of how come the American population is increasing so fast. And he was delighted in Paris to meet one of Franklin's co-commissioners, Silas Deane, who was from Connecticut. And the Abbé Raynal hoped that since Mr. Deane was from Connecticut, he could perhaps tell him about where Polly Baker lived and if they ever made a statue to her. And Deane said, well, I thought that was a hoax. And Abbé Raynal said, no, it couldn't be a hoax because I read it in a book. And it's published in newspaper. So this must be a true thing. And this conversation goes on for a few minutes with Deane saying, I didn't think that was a true story, and Abbé Raynal insisting that it must be, until finally Franklin confessed that yes, he knew it to be a hoax because, in fact, he had written it. And he wrote other things, too. And again, he was a printer. He learned to print as a boy in his brother's printing shop, and so he was able to actually work very quickly. He was a very skilled workman. So think about it. He's engaged with intellectuals like the Abbé Raynal and others we'll talk about in a bit, but also someone whose hands are dirty with printer's ink and knows how to operate a printing press. How many times a day he would pull the bar to press down the patterns and make type. And he knew the process of making type. And he also set up others in printing. He's a great businessman. He also has a tremendous work ethic. In fact, the phrase he keeps repeating, which his father had repeated to him, seest thou a man diligent in his labor, he will stand before kings. He will not stand before mean men. And Franklin says he found that to be true, because in the course of his life, he had in fact stood before 5 kings, and he even sat down with one to dinner. So being diligent in a calling is a way to achieve not necessarily wealth, but respectability, which is certainly something Franklin did achieve, despite his vulgar essay, as Senator Moore would put it. And of course, the one thing that makes him famous, and again, before the talk, someone was reminiscing about other Franklin sayings, which still resounds to us from Poor Richard's Almanac. Mark Twain had said those dreadful aphorisms that were old at the time of Noah and the flood that Franklin repeated in Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard actually makes Franklin quite successful. In fact, it sells about 10,000 copies a year. This is an almanac, for those who aren't familiar with it. It's not the first almanac. There were other almanacs. In fact, there was another successful American almanac published by someone named Titan Leeds. And Mr. Leeds was a fairly contentious, litigious fellow. That is, he was constantly suing other printers, publishers. And when Richard Saunders, the fictional character that Franklin created to publish his almanac, breaks onto the scene, Titan Leeds was already well established. And the first issue of Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732 says that Richard Saunders had been engaged for a number of years in a friendly argument with his good friend Titan Leeds about, they were both students of the astronomical charts. Richard Saunders compiled these astronomical charts every year, phases of the moon, tides, and other things. And his wife, Bridget, his long-suffering wife, Bridget, wondered why he was mooning about looking at stars and not, in fact, earning any money. And so Richard Saunders decided that he should start earning money by publishing an almanac. But, of course, the thing holding him back was his friendship and affection for Titan Leeds, his fellow stargazer who already had an almanac. However, in the issue of Poor Richard's Almanac, the first issue in 1732, Richard Saunders explains that Titan Leeds is going on October 17th, 1733 at 3:29 in the afternoon, according to Richard Saunders' observation of the galactic hosts, will die. He says Titan Leeds has studied the same astronomical charts, and he thinks he will live until the 26th of October. But in either case, he will no longer be with us to conduct his almanac, thus Richard Saunders should fill in this gap now. Well, people thought this was pretty funny. One person who didn't think it was funny at all, I should tell you, is Titan Leeds. And in the almanac the next year, Titan Leeds blasted Richard Saunders as a fool and a buffoon and other things. Now, what do you do if you're Richard Saunders, and by the way, or if you're Benjamin Franklin? Well, you say this is proof that Titan Leeds is dead. The fact that he's calling you a fool, because your friend Titan Leeds was too much of a gentleman to use such abusive language. So this demonstrates that Titan Leeds, in fact, is dead, and his almanac now is being conducted by an imposter. Within a week, 3 editions of Poor Richard's Almanac had sold. And every year it would sell 10,000 copies. Think about that, $3 per issue, 10,000 copies a year. This is a pretty steady income produced by this almanac. It does have those dreadful aphorisms and those sayings about lying down with dogs, getting up with fleas. It also has witty things, and it has useful information such as tides and phases of the moon, and also weather. Think about this, they're predicting the weather a year in advance. And how accurate is this going to be? Well, in fact, Poor Richard does mention this. This really isn't, of course, the reason he becomes an internationally famous, an international celebrity, or someone who will be in halls of fame for swimming, chess, and other things. The real thing that makes Franklin's career, makes him memorable, is something that happens as he is retiring from the world of printing. In fact, by the time he's in his early 40s, he's able to retire from printing. He set up about a dozen other men as printers throughout the American colonies. In fact, by the 1760s, there are about a dozen or so American newspapers, and his apprentices, his former apprentices, are printing more than half of them. He's set up printers in the West Indies, in Charleston, South Carolina, in New England, and he retires. He franchises the printing business, and it gives him an annual income of about $200,000 a year, which he can use to devote to other things. And the thing that really captivates him is electricity. He visited Boston in 1743 and saw a fellow named Dr. Archibald Spencer, a Scottish doctor, who demonstrated how you could cure electrical disease, cure diseases of the eye with electricity, or the electrical fluid, as it was called. Remember, in Boston at this time, you could not have theatrical performances. You could pass off a theatrical performance as a moral lecture or a philosophical lecture. And Dr. Spencer's lecture on how to cure diseases of the eye using the electrical fluid involved suspending a boy horizontally in the air, and then Dr. Spencer would rub a glass tube and then rub the tube against the boy's feet, and sparks would shoot out of the boy's eyes. It doesn't cure diseases of the eye, but it makes for a great demonstration. I suggested to John we do that tonight. We didn't think the lighting would be sufficient, or we could find a boy willing to do this. Franklin is fascinated with this. And at about the same, there are other people doing similar experiments with electricity, or the electrical fluid, as it was called. There are in Germany different demonstrations. You can have an electrical kiss. And Franklin does get some electrical apparatus from a correspondent in London. And having retired from the printing business, he devotes himself over this next winter to doing experiments and also writing down how they conduct the experiments, what the protocol is, how you can replicate an experiment. And he coins terms for some of the things they are discovering. For example, you have a jar manufactured in Leyden by a Dr. Muschenbroek And Dr. Mushenbrook's jar, Franklin calls a Leyden jar. And you can actually keep an electrical charge in this. And then Franklin and his friends who had been former apprentices, thus they're good at making things with their hands, make a series of bottles containing them all together so you can have a greater electrical charge. And what do you call something in which you store a great electrical charge? Franklin calls it a battery. One end of the battery has a different charge from the other end, and he calls those positive and negative. And actually putting the electrical fluid into the bottle, Franklin calls that charging. So if you have charged a battery, you've actually used terms Franklin coined back in the 1740s. He also calls this group of guys who spend the winter doing these experiments with the electrical fluid electricians. And he has a question. They all have a question. They're not just trying to figure out what makes these sparks. They're really trying to understand what holds the world together. What makes the world work? Remember, it's just 24 years since Sir Isaac Newton had passed away, and they're all thinking about the world in something of a different way. And here you have this force that seems to be in all of these things. You can get more of it by rubbing a glass jar with a piece of wool. Well, where does it come from? What does it do? And then, having done these experiments with glass jars and pieces of cork and seen sparks shooting off from them, they've also seen, of course, what look like big sparks shooting off from clouds. Could electricity be in clouds? Perhaps that is what a bolt of lightning is, an electrical charge. Well, how would you demonstrate this? And Franklin proposed putting a sentry box on top of a church steeple and then having an iron rod extending from the top of the sentry box. And someone inside the church steeple can have a wire coming from the rod, and then he would be able, if this in fact is electricity, could discharge it into a Leyden jar, demonstrating that, yeah, lightning is electricity, but more importantly, the clouds contain electricity. And lightning is a manifestation of the clouds having more of a charge than the earth, or vice versa. And this would be a way of demonstrating this if only you had a church steeple tall enough. And the problem for Franklin in 1750-51 was there wasn't a church steeple that tall in Philadelphia. In fact, there were no church steeples at all. He did subscribe to a fund for Christ Church to build a church steeple. I don't know if the minister realized why Franklin was subscribing so generously to the fund to build a steeple. There were church steeples in Boston, but no electricians there. However, in Europe, where Franklin's book is published, in fact, all of his books are published first in Europe, not in America. And every year, he is writing up the experiments that the Philadelphia electricians have conducted. And every year, these are being printed in England and in France and in Germany. And they're circulating among the other scientific thinkers, or as they would have been called, natural philosophers of the day. Well, if you had a church steeple, you could do this. And of course, they do have church steeples in Europe. And they have the protocol from the Philadelphia experiments, as they call Franklin's book. So in Paris, outside Paris actually, a French scientist, natural philosopher, builds an apparatus to test whether lightning is electricity. In Germany, German natural philosophers are doing the same thing, testing this. And they demonstrate that, yes, in fact, clouds contain electricity. You're not simply waiting for a lightning storm. When the clouds pass over, when clouds which you know contain electricity pass over, they will discharge into this rod on top of the church steeple. So in 1751, in the summer of 1751, we have reports being written in Europe about the Philadelphia experiment being conducted in France and in Germany and in England, demonstrating all of this. Now, Franklin got tired of waiting for the steeple to be built, so he did prevail upon his son one day to go and fly a kite with him. And Franklin doesn't tell people he's doing this, and it's only years later that he records what exactly happened that day. His son gets the kite in the air, and he has a key attached to the string. This may be the most famous scientific experiment in American history. And in fact, one of Franklin's admirers said this was the greatest scientific experiment since the time of Isaac Newton. But we don't know if it actually happened or when it happened. Think about this. If you're a man in your 40s and you're going to go fly a kite one day when it looks like it might rain, you're probably not going to tell all of your friends what you're doing, whereas Mark Twain said, going to fish for electricity. But they do demonstrate that this is what happened. But they didn't need to do this, because in Europe it had already been proven that clouds contain electricity. In fact, electricity is something contained in everything. And this is a phenomenal achievement. In fact, Benjamin Franklin receives the Copley Medal of the Royal Society. This, at the time, was the highest scientific award in the world. And he is the first non-member of the Royal Society to receive the Copley Medal, the first non-British person to receive the Copley Medal. And then he is admitted into the Royal Society, and I believe he's the first person to be admitted having his membership dues waived. They are so excited to get Dr. Franklin in the Royal Society, the Philadelphia experimenter, who is showing the nature of the world. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, called Franklin the Prometheus of the modern age. He had taken lightning from the sky. He had demystified this thing, this force that could knock down a house, burn down a house, could kill you. He had shown what it contains and how you can tame it. He was always disappointed they couldn't do more with it than produce lightning rods, but he was always imagining that someday there would be a use for this force, some way of channeling it, some way of making this work. It was one of his disappointments that that's not something that happened in his lifetime. And it's this scientific experiment, this playing with electricity, that turns Franklin into an international celebrity. He received a master's degree, an honorary master's degree from Harvard. In fact, the first honorary degree that institution ever bestowed. And think about it. He had about a year of formal education. And then he also received an honorary master's degree from Yale. And then a doctorate from St. Andrews in Scotland. And then an honorary doctorate from Oxford. That is, he is the world's leading scientist by the time, just shortly after he is retired from printing. He takes what essentially was a parlor trick, showing you how you can shoot sparks out of a boy's eyes, and turning it into a science, how you can replicate these experiments and come to understand how the world works. In 1776, Franklin is sent by the American Congress to Paris to hopefully bring the French into an alliance with the United States. And he is received there as this apostle of the New World, this representative of the New World. Turgot, a former French minister of finance, created a Latin motto for Franklin, which is, he seized lightning from the heavens and the scepter from the tyrants. Everywhere Franklin went in Paris, he was received as this genius who has come to deliver the world. This is how he meets Voltaire, how he meets other French philosophers. French ladies start wearing their hair in the Franklin style. And that phrase, he seized lightning from the heavens and the scepter from the tyrants, is printed, is actually put onto porcelain figurines of Franklin. Well, of course, one person in France not keen about seizing scepters from tyrants was King Louis XVI. And there was a lady of the French court, Diane Polignac, and the king thought she was overly fond of Franklin, so the king had a chamber pot made for her with Franklin's image in the bottom, and that phrase about seizing lightning from the heavens, so she could reflect on her hero. But this is part, Franklin becomes a great diplomat, and his work in France in the 1780s, bringing the French into an alliance with the Americans, but the French government, but more importantly, establishing this relationship with the people of France and what Franklin and the New World represent to them is something almost impossible for us to understand or recover. Now, one final story about Franklin, which I think does exemplify this characteristic he has. I remember growing up very poor in Boston, And through hard work and enterprise and great curiosity, making himself into an international figure who is part of this world. In 1783 in France, a couple of French brothers named Montgolfier were doing experiments with hot air balloons. And again, the science behind this, and I should explain I'm not a scientist, I probably don't need to explain that if any of you is a scientist, the way I've been describing these various phenomena, comes from work that one of Franklin's colleagues, Lavoisier, had been doing about different properties of gases. And some gases, gases expand and contract at different temperatures, and you actually could separate out these different facets, and a phenomenon that warm air actually rises. This may seem like such a common sense thing to us, but it's actually the reason Franklin built a stove in the 1730s, was to test how air does rise. Warm air rises, cooler air falls. And I think the next lecture will be about how the Franklin stove works, and probably will not do that on an August day, but we'll wait for February to explain the workings of the stove. But the French brothers Montgolfier realized that if you actually heated air in a balloon, you could make the balloon rise, and then you could carry all kinds of things up in the air with it. And the first experiments, they actually brought up a couple of chickens to see if they would survive being higher up in the air. And then a cow, and then sheep, and other ways of showing that a living being can ascend off of the earth and then come safely back down, controlling the flight. And a person can do this. And one day in 1783, a person was making a balloon ascension in Paris. And thousands of people turned out to see this phenomenon of someone, a living person, actually rising off the earth, controlling this flight, and then coming back down by cooling the air. And people were just watching this in awe, except for one cynic, and usually there should be at least one cynic, looking at this balloon going up, said, "What good is it?" Franklin said, "What good is a newborn baby?" That's really the epitome of Franklin, thinking about not what we will do immediately, but what is going to be what will a newborn baby be able to do over the course of his or her life? These are the characteristics of Franklin that come from his background here in New England, and this great curiosity he carried with him, and his curiosity which continues to enlighten our world. So, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if that's acceptable, or if I'll discreetly close my eyes, and those of you who want to bolt. Questions, rebuttals?
During the after the Revolutionary War, when Franklin and Jefferson and Adams, I think, were trying to negotiate the peace accord, the way I've read it was that Franklin slowed down the process.
You've been reading about John Adams.
Yeah.
John Adams really almost botched this. Okay, John Adams and Franklin were like oil and vinegar. It's of interest. Well, I try to wean myself of using the word interesting, because when I say it, it may not be. Yeah. The first time Abigail saw John Adams was in Cambridge. She had gone to Franklin, and a delegation from Congress were meeting with General Washington. And Abigail just wrote this gushing letter to her husband, having gone and seen Dr. Franklin. And she said, "Since I was a young girl, I had learned to venerate Dr. Franklin." And he didn't say a word at dinner, which is what Franklin would do if he were at any kind of a social gathering. He wouldn't say a word. However, she said, "I studied him. I studied his face and his physiognomy, and I realized he must be a deeply Christian man, because he's such a patriot. And you couldn't be a great patriot without being a Christian," which I think would be one reason Abigail would become disillusioned when she did get to know Franklin better in Paris. And then John also, because John Adams came to Paris with the idea that the United States is a rising empire. This is the future here. And France really needs us to help weaken England more than we need them. Franklin understood that that wasn't true. There were 3 million Americans. There were 25 million Frenchmen. And in fact, the Americans would only be able to win their war if they had weapons from France and military supplies from France. And the Americans also were broke. Remember, I mean, that's as, in fact, in 1785, the United States could not repay the loan the French government had given the United States. And this is, of course, France is teetering on bankruptcy in this period. So Adams believed that Adams didn't like the French. I mean, I'm not pro or anti-French, but Adams is a New Englander, and New Englanders had been fighting against the French for a long time. And he comes to France with an idea that we're really allowing the French to help us. And I just thought that was the lightning is about to strike as I'm saying these things here in New England about John Adams. Anyway, Franklin did not slow things down. He understood the workings of the French court. He also understood that in order to do anything in France, you did need to flirt with French ladies who had wielded a great deal of power, and he was very good at doing that. John Adams was not quite so good. There's one dinner in Paris where a French lady says to Mr. Adams, since his name suggests he is descended from the first man and woman, perhaps he could explain how the first man and woman found the art of making love. I mean, how would you come up with a witty answer to your second language? So, yeah, Adams, at one point in the negotiations, the other two commissioners want to go to the French government and demand 25 million livres. Franklin knows how precarious the relationship is with France, as well as how precarious France's finances are, and suggests that maybe they wait. And they say, no, we can't wait because we need the money. And Adams does go to Vergennes, the French foreign minister, demand 25 million livres. And the next thing we know is that the French government officially writes to the American government saying it would be good if Mr. Adams did not have any more dealings with the French court. And Franklin, for his part, admired many things about Adams. And Adams comes to admire things about Franklin, although lots of things about Franklin, for good reason, drive Adams to distraction. One is, and again, it makes it sound like I'm justifying this, Franklin's secretary, Edward Bancroft, was actually a British agent. And Franklin was not he's in his 70s. His grandson is actually his secretary. His grandson, Temple Franklin, and his grandson is really kind of a rogue and is really interested more in French ladies than in conducting diplomacy. And Franklin leaves papers scattered about on the desk where anyone can get them, and Mr. Bancroft will spirit documents off to a tree in Paris, and then from there will be taken on a boat off to London. And in fact, one day the British ambassador comes to protest to Vergennes about something the Americans are proposing to the French government, and this is before Vergennes has heard about it. That is, the British government has heard first, because, as I said, Franklin's secretary is a spy, and Franklin seems to know that he's a spy, and it doesn't bother him. And it's a more subtle thing. By the way, I'm not advising this if any of you is in diplomacy, that it's a good thing if your secretary is a spy. But in this particular context, if the French government believes there's a good chance the Americans may reconcile with the British government, which the fact that the Americans are communicating closely with the British government would indicate, the French government probably should do more to make sure the Americans don't do that. So it's a subtle thing. Anyway, Franklin does say, just before he leaves France, that Mr. Adams, in the interests of his country, is always an honest man, and often a great one. And sometimes he is absolutely out of his senses, which I think is true, and is probably reading things like this in the records of the American Foreign Ministry doesn't help Adams come to think more highly of Franklin. But yeah, no, I think the short answer to your question is no, I don't think that's the way it was, but I should have probably stuck with that. Yes, sir?
The title of your lecture is The Invention of America.
Yep.
And Ben Franklin. I grew up believing that Frank Capra lived in America instead of Ben Franklin. And I'm saying that obviously facetiously, but you mentioned something about Franklin and his relationships with what we would call opponents, either economic opponents, international opponents. And he would always seem to find himself, and then you just told the story about the agent that worked for him. Do you think it was deliberate? You kind of implied that it was, he intentionally allowed the communication of what was going on in America to kind of seep out. He wanted it to be a soft landing, even though it was a war. He wanted it to be a soft landing. Did you find that in research?
Yes, I think that's a very apt way of putting it, that he understood this. He's trying, this is, by the way, another reason that Adams doesn't trust him, is because he had been trying to reconcile with the British Empire. And his son, of course, is a loyalist. His son had been governor of New Jersey, and some of Franklin's political opponents said it's just like the Franklins. They choose different sides in this, so that whichever side wins can pardon the other one. A soft landing. He also knew how terrible a war would be, and you can't really anticipate where a war is going to go. So yeah, he is allowing things to leak for this reasons of bringing some kind of consensus. I mean, it's what he wanted. This is why David Hume and George Whitfield are both among his friends. And he has these personal friendships with people who are really polar opposites. There are people who don't like him. It's hard to find anyone that he doesn't like. So yeah, and his thinking about this at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he's the one who reminds the other delegates of the importance of what they are doing and putting aside their petty squabbles so that we can create something. And doing this in a number of different ways. In his last speech to the convention, he does talk about putting aside a little of our own certainty, a little of our own infallibility. He says, I don't support everything in this Constitution, but I'm not sure I never will, because over a long life I've come to change my mind about things about which I was certain. So yeah, that's, thank you for raising the point. Yes, sir.
What do you think led Franklin to become a patriot? Do you think it was sort of a scientific mindset that, as Payne says, the sun doesn't orbit the earth, the American colonies are large, why should we be paying tribute to it? Or was it scientific, or was it perhaps coming from his business background that, like other merchants, he was, becoming powerful and making money and didn't see the need to have a king running the show?
Well, he's not really a merchant. He's a printer. He's retired from business. I think you're on to something with this, but it's less, and again, think about the scientific method Franklin uses as one where you rely on empirical evidence. It's not an idea, it's not the reason, but it is actual experience and actual seeing things. And Franklin spent 15 years in London, and he's part of British society in many ways. And he comes to see the corruption of British society. In fact, it's just before he begins this break that he tours Ireland and Scotland. And he sees the real poverty in Ireland and Scotland. And here, he sees a great future for the British Empire. In 1751, he wrote an essay on population. Talks about how fast the American population grows. And he said in 100 years, there will be more Englishmen on this side of the Atlantic than on the other. And what a great thing this will be for the British Empire. So he's thinking about the empire, but then relatively quickly in the 1770s, he changes. He's not really that opposed to the Stamp Act, although he goes to Parliament and explains why the Americans are reacting as they are to the Stamp Act. After the destruction of the tea, he thought it would be a good thing if the Americans paid the East India Company, because that would bring them onto the side of the Americans. It's this kind of seeming duplicity, which is another reason the Adamses never really trust him. But then he's also thinking about how he thought that these two countries, the Americans and Britain, could be part of one empire. And to my mind, the moment where it really see a change is when he appears before the Privy Council. This is after the destruction of the tea, and Franklin had leaked some letters of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, back in Hutchinson, governor of Massachusetts. And Franklin's reason in sending these letters that Hutchinson had written to a British official was he wanted to show the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the Provincial Assembly, that the real enemy wasn't the ministry, it was Governor Hutchinson. And this destroys Thomas Hutchinson's political reputation in America. And Franklin had sent these telling, by the way, if you send something to Samuel Adams and tell him, don't publish this, the first thing he's going to do is publish it, which is what happens. Ruins Thomas Hutchinson. And the Assembly wants to get rid of poor Hutchinson as governor, and the Privy Council is going to do this hearing. It happens to be 2 days after London's learned about the destruction of the tea. And no one in London is really interested in what's happening with why Massachusetts doesn't like Thomas Hutchinson at this moment. And the hearing turns into an hour-long excoriation of Benjamin Franklin by the Solicitor General, calling him a man without honor, someone who's not content with being here as an agent of a provincial assembly. Instead, he imagines himself as the ambassador of an independent empire. And hereafter, Franklin will cringe at being called a man of letters and other things. He's a common thief. And what happens during this, it's not that what Wedderburn says really upsets Franklin. He's looking around the room because everyone who is anyone in British society is there because they know this is going to be a spectacle, and it is. And they are enjoying this, enjoying watching Dr. Franklin being taken down a few pegs. I mean, who does he think he is? Doesn't even have, he has a year of schooling. And here he is imagining himself to be the ambassador of an independent empire. Franklin had thought that by replacing Thomas Hutchinson with a governor more able to negotiate with the Assembly, I should make it clear that actually the leading student of Thomas Hutchinson is in the room with us tonight, so I'm trying to be cautious as how I phrase it. He thought by replacing Hutchinson with someone else, you could save the empire. He leaves the meeting thinking, the empire's not worth saving. These people are enjoying watching. These are the people he thought were his friends. He thought that the empire appreciated America. He sees the empire really doesn't. And he becomes really committed to independence after that. So that's, I think, it. It's this experience of seeing how the British government works and wanting to avoid the kind of corruption and decadence that you have in England. Yes?
How was Ben's French? Did he speak any French before he went there?
A little bit. He got better. John Adams said his French wasn't very good. I don't know how John Adams was a judge of someone else's French, but he actually learns French in a very good way. A number of French women undertake to teach him French, so they do spend a lot of time writing in French, speaking in French, so he can practice his French. Yeah, so it's pretty good. He actually also had taught himself Italian, Spanish. He thought the dead languages were dead. However, he does learn Latin after learning Italian and Spanish, and then learns French because he already knew those other two languages. Yes?
Yeah, Bob. Do you have one or two biographies of Franklin that you particularly admire?
My favorite is still Carl Van Doren's book from the 1930s. There have been some recent books that are really very good. My favorite, more recent one, I think, actually there's a really good book by a fellow named Epstein, Daniel Mark Epstein, about William Franklin and Benjamin Franklin, the relationship of father and son. That's really a good book. Van Doren also wrote a biography of Franklin's sister Jane. There have been two biographies of Franklin's sister, one by Carl Van Doren and one by Jill Lepore. And I like Gordon Wood's more recent book, too.
Who's?
Gordon Wood.
Yeah.
Yes, one more, this gentleman in back.
I got two questions. How big a womanizer was he, and what effect did he have on the U.S. Constitution?
Those are both really good questions. I don't think he's as big a womanizer as he's given credit for. But again, that's part of his reputation, this flirting. He does have a child out of wedlock, and he does talk in his autobiography about wanting to get married because otherwise he's dealing with that hard-to-be-governed passion of youth, and he feared a distemper from the low women who fell in his path. So he marries Miss Reed, and then he spends, he has close friendships among women and flirtations among women. It's hard to tell whether this is womanizing in the context we might understand it. Certainly John Adams thought it was womanizing, and Charles Wilson Peale, the Philadelphia artist, happened to be in London and walked in on Franklin, and he was sitting there with a woman in his lap. They're both fully dressed, and Peale goes home and sketches this. So it's different from someone holding up a camera at this, going home and sketching it. So hard to tell how much of a womanizer he is. I hate to destroy the illusions we have of the founding flirt, but a lot of those stories come from the time when he's in Paris, and remember, he's in his 70s. He's suffering from both gout and kidney stones. One of his French friends, Madame Briand, when Franklin writes to her complaining about his gout, says that perhaps it's been brought on by having 5 or 6 pretty mistresses. And Franklin says, when I was young, and ladies were kinder to me, I didn't have the gout. And now that women aren't being kind to me, I do have the gout. So, I don't know. It's perhaps because he writes a lot about it that we know more about it. Then it's a good question.
It's from his Paris years.
Yeah, most of that's from his Paris years. There are stories. Yeah, he and Deborah only have 2 children. One dies at the age of 4, and it's interesting because the rest of his family have large families. Remember, he is one of 13, and he's the youngest son of his father, and his father was so. Good question. Effect on the U.S. Constitution. That's another very good question, and I should tell you that I've just done a series for the teaching company, 24 half-hour lectures on Franklin, and I actually have a half-hour lecture on both women and the Constitution and a lot of other things, so I hesitate to burden you with them now. But he does have a large effect. Every day he's carried in on a sedan chair to the Constitutional Convention Hall, and he sits in the front. The only times he speaks, he has written out a speech in advance. He never thought of himself as a very good speaker, but he was a very good writer. And so he has 3 speeches read to the convention. The first is advising that the president not get a salary, because he said ambition and avarice are the 2 driving forces that most people have, and if you combine the 2, you would do great damage. They don't adopt that. And then as the convention is breaking down, this is in June, they've been at this for about 6 weeks, the small states and the big states are really arguing past each other about whether population or states should be represented. And at this point, Franklin has a speech read saying that 15 years ago in this room, we had daily prayers for divine guidance, and those prayers were heard and they were answered. How has it been that we've not yet thought of applying to the Father of Lights to illuminate our understanding? And he calls on them to hold prayers. And they don't do that because they don't have money to hire a preacher. And also they worry. They've been meeting in secret for 6 weeks. People outside are wondering what they're doing, and if suddenly they're calling in ministers to pray with them, people will realize how botched things are. It does make them to realize the importance of what they're doing. And then his final speech, which I think I mentioned, calling for us to put aside a little of our own certainty. However, he's also on the committee that frames the compromise of having one house represent states, one represent population. And he says that when your carpenter is making a table, he has to cut the boards, take some off of each side so that it will fit. But probably the one time I know of that he spoke extemporaneously was when the delegates were considering whether only property owners, freeholders, should be able to vote for members of Congress. Freeholders are the upholders of liberty. If you work for someone else, you're going to be dependent on that person. So you go to a town meeting, you stand up, everyone knows how you vote. And so if we can only have freeholders voting, it will prevent the propertyless from selling their votes and having the kind of corruption you see in Europe. And John Dickinson thinks this is a good idea. Gouverneur Morris thinks it's a good idea. James Madison thinks this is a good idea. Most people are freeholders now. They won't object to this. We're thinking about the future. Nathaniel Gorham from Massachusetts, a Boston merchant, says, well, we have elections in Boston where people who don't own property vote, and they're just as good as anywhere else. It's probably the last time anyone held up a Boston election as an example of purity. And George Mason, Virginia planter, says you shouldn't really, the parent of a large number of children who are all going to pursue their fortunes in their own country shouldn't be treated as suspicious characters. And then Franklin stands up, son of a Boston soap boiler. He says, don't insult the virtue and common sense of ordinary people. And he in Paris had been the most closely involved with American prisoners in Europe, mainly sailors. American sailors taken prisoner by the British could become free if they joined the British Navy, but they refused. British sailors couldn't wait to join the American Navy because the two countries treat common people differently, poor people differently. And he said in England, Parliament passed a law saying that tumultuous meetings are dangerous, so we'll restrict the vote to freeholders. The next Parliament then imposes special burdens on people who aren't voters. So you begin by taking away the vote. So Franklin, the son of the Boston soap boiler, knows the difference between the United States and England is in the way